Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. After heavy criticism from multiple world champions during the Bahrain test about the state of the power units for 2026, reports have it F1 are already considering radical changes to the electrical deployment to try and make this a better driving and spectating experience, especially at circuits which are far more battery sensitive and will be a disaster, according to some of the drivers, if this goes ahead as we saw in Bahrain. Many teams want severe changes. Mercedes, however, are pushing back against this, potentially because they think they have an advantage the more of the battery is required. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. A lot of nuance to get into today. We're just going to quickly start here because if you saw a couple of weeks ago, Jenson Button officially is now an Aston Martin ambassador. Damon Hill thought, you know what, I gotta have some of that. He is officially a 2026 ambassador alongside Jamie Chadwick and Jacques Villeneuve as well. Just a quick one on Williams, on Red Bull. So we talked about this, the rankings of the teams after testing. Red Bull are unanimously third or fourth, depending on who you ask. Most people, it seems, have them in fourth right now. But after day one of testing in Bahrain, some people had them first. That's certainly where Mercedes put them. They reached in Verstappen's hands. I mean, it wasn't much of a challenge. He was 344 kph on the straight, presumably because he put his foot down like everyone else did. But he had harvested more battery on that lap than others had, and it looked like Red Bull were deploying more heavily into turn one than we saw later on. Now, as I said yesterday, it's somewhat unclear as to whether that top speed which Verstappen had, which was not reached at all for the rest of the 2 weeks of testing, was because Red Bull have turned their engines down, or because they figured out that there was actually a better way to deploy that energy around the lap, right? I suppose air resistance being, proportional to the square of a factor of the vehicle's velocity means that as you get higher and higher, it probably becomes less useful to deploy the energy there. You'd be better off deploying it elsewhere. So my theory is the reason why they didn't get to those figures again is because they figured out a better way of deploying the energy over the lap. But who knows? Maybe they did turn the engine down, because James Vowles says he's the only one to really comment on this. Red Bull looked good until we spoke about their power unit. Then they turn it down quite a bit. I think he might be right, but also how much did they turn it down? Was that really the reason why they didn't have the performance it seemed for the rest of the test than they did on day one? There might be multiple factors here, but as we saw yesterday, George Russell said the gap that they seemed like they had was reduced drastically by the final day. And these teams look at all the GPS data. They will figure out as much as they can. It is the opinion of Mercedes that they close the gap a lot in that regard. It is the opinion of James Vowles. The Red Bull turn their engines down a lot, so make of that what you will. The other interesting development on the Red Bull side is around Yuki Tsunoda. So, of course, Yuki no longer driving the upcoming season at Red Bull or Racing Bulls, but he is nonetheless the reserve driver for both of those teams anyway, and reportedly he has free practice sessions scheduled for Racing Bulls this year. Now he's simulator driver still for the team, reserve driver as well. But this is pretty unusual, right? Because you would typically just see the free practice sessions going to rookie drivers. But of course, in this case, they have Lindblad in as a rookie, so he doesn't have to give up his sessions. Liam Lawson would for somebody, I guess we'll see. Ayumi Iwasa has driven before, but also they're no longer having the Honda relationship, so that Japanese connection is slightly less strong than it used to be. But as we know, Tsunoda is still there. So it is interesting because clearly with Yuki doing a lot of work in the sim, they want Yuki's feedback with him actually in the car in free practice sessions, even though they're not mandated to put him in the car because of the, the rookie rules and all that, which they usually would be the only reason to change a driver in a free practice session. But it seems like they still value Yuki enough to give him some free practice sessions and believe that will be most useful for the team, given his performance, his ability, and what he feels in the sim. But this is it not a bit of an indictment on Liam Lawson to a degree? Obviously, Lindblad is brand new, so we'll see how he gets on. It's exciting, his first rookie year. But if you really believed in Lawson, given that you've chosen him as your driver over Tsunoda again for Racing Bulls this season, again, Yuki, there was talk about him maybe better off on another team. There was some discussion about Haas could be interested at some point as well. But if he was offered to have Lawson's seats, presumably he would have taken it, even though Hadjar was getting promoted to Red Bull regardless. And yeah, Yuki did not have a good end to last season, or really the entirety of last season, since he stepped in Japan. But if Lawson had the full backing of Racing Bulls, then they would say, well, look, you're our driver. You are the man who is in the simulator as well. So we're going to listen to you. But maybe they're going to say, Lindblad, it's been a pleasure, but, we're just going to step you out for a couple of sessions, put Yuki in, and see what he feels like in terms of correlation and for the car perspective. It is also going to be interesting, therefore, to see what kind of lap times Yuki does. Because if he's in the car in the sim, and then they're scheduling him in practice sessions in place of one of their drivers, then we'll get to see a little bit of a comparison there. So maybe there's something like that going on as well, that Racing Bulls just want to be sure that Yuki isn't just rapid on these regulations, and that they might need to make a change in the very near future. This is Audi's rear wing, the active aerodynamics. Now, we saw various different solutions for the active aero on the rear wing. The standard approach is in the centre here. The McLaren and the Mercedes, relatively similar in their ideas. It's more traditional DRS. Of course, Ferrari had a very radically different approach with their inverted rear wing. This is Audi's at the bottom. You can see that it's kind of a halfway ground between what Alpine are doing at the top here and what the other teams are doing, mostly apart from that Ferrari beauty, which we're not sure if they're going to bring back, but they probably will after putting all that development in. So their wing drops down at the back and lifts up at the front, so it has less of a slot gap, but also the airflow at the top is maybe slightly cleaner. I don't know, it's a slightly more crude solution, but presumably it still works. The interesting one until Ferrari came along was what Alpine were doing by dropping the rear flap down as opposed to lifting it up as it would be traditional. Now Audi, after using this version at the bottom, have now copied, effectively, the Alpine approach. This seems to be a better solution because I don't really like... I'm not an aerodynamicist, but this does not seem like the best solution, given what we've seen elsewhere. And this is now what Audi unveiled right at the end of the test, actually, that not many people spotted, which was that rear wing dropping down in the same way that we saw with the Alpine. So this was the previous iteration in Bahrain 1. Then in Bahrain 2, they pulled out this version with, again, you see a radically different design of the actuator and the way that they're trying to get that done. It doesn't appear there could be major differences between the straight line speed of these various options, but what is true about the Alpine and now the Audi solution is that they snap into place not only quicker, but if you imagine the airflow with what would be traditionally DRS open, an aerodynamicist might say the flows are separated, right? You've got a flow running here through the slot gap, and then you've got another whole barrage of air coming over the top. If you reduce that so you've effectively only got one element, then when you snap it back into place, the downforce you generate is either generated in incrementally more smoothly fashion than the alternative. It might not be a big deal, but it could mean that they're able to close it slightly later than their rivals and still get the downforce where they want it heading into the corner. So there could be options in there that could give Audi and Alpine a slight advantage. Obviously, the real exciting one is nonetheless what Ferrari have done with this top upper element, which completely inverts. I think one of the most innovative ideas around this is the idea of having the actuators in the side rather than centrally, as we have seen all the teams do so far. So that could be another option that teams explore, even if they're not going to go for the Ferrari inverted DRS idea, which we'll see if it makes a return in due course. Couple of quick things on Aston Martin. There is a feeling that the car is so far behind that it is just not salvageable this season. The question, I suppose, is could the developments this year be enough to give Alonso a chance next year? Or is this going to be it, right? Because if the team doesn't make enough progress, if Honda is not in position to give a competitive power unit, it will become clear that Alonso will not be able to win a title this year, next year, maybe the year after. But at that point, does he really want to stay around into his late 40s, as it will be at that point? And it would be so frustrating, I'm sure, for Alonso to drive a car like that again. his relationship with Honda has not been the best, to say the very least. But Marca reports that this is likely Alonso's final season. Aston are considered to have basically the worst car right now, and I'm sure that won't be the case at the end of the season, but it's still going to probably be nowhere near enough. And reportedly, about 3 to 4 months ago, it became very clear that the Honda targets were not being met, and they were going to start the season in a really bad way. That's pretty much when Cowell stepped away. Apparently, he's been spending a lot of time in Japan with Honda on the power unit development. Of course, he was the mastermind to a certain extent behind a lot of Mercedes' success in the turbo hybrid era. So there is something about that. Maybe, look, these are long-term projects to try and turn around, but there's a feeling that the team and Alonso realized 3 to 4 months ago this was not going to happen this year. And as a result, at best, it's going to be the 5th fastest car, maybe by the end of the season, and that is probably a stretch. And I mean, does Alonso really want to be in that spot? Even that would be an optimistic scenario right now, and that would mean Alonso's scrapping for points, right? Which I don't know if he really wants to be there, especially if there's not much optimism around the Honda engine. The other teams will have a much better baseline to improve on. It's going to take a serious amount of time to catch up. Look, could they do a McLaren where they turn around from 2023 to all of a sudden winning the championship the following year? Maybe, but it just feels very optimistic right now. And the reality is that the drivers that were linked to potentially going to Aston Martin, the Russells, the Verstappens, the Leclercs, in a world where Fernando retires, or in a world where Verstappen goes to Mercedes and Russell needs an alternative, that type of stuff, then Aston is no longer really a conversation. Those guys do not have much interest, and you can understand why, certainly not for the near term. There was the article from Marca also described how they think maybe Japan is where the upgrades might arrive in time on the engine side. There's some talk from Honda that they have a new engine, or at least an upgraded version, try to get that ready for China. But now apparently it's more likely it will be Japan instead. But the article says that even with the fixes for their engine so it doesn't destroy the battery and that the gearbox can handle it, whatever, they've got a lot of problems to solve. They will still be 5% down on rivals. That's 50 horsepower. That's a huge deal, right? Like, that is at least a second and a half a lap, I would suggest, based on some of the data we've seen in recent seasons. That would mean they would have an awful lot of time to an awful lot of energy as well and money to deploy into upgrading the power unit, because they'd be in the additional development and upgrade opportunities section by being outside of 4% of the benchmark. But still, that's a big deficit to catch up, and not one that they are going to be able to achieve very swiftly indeed. And that's even assuming they solve their other problems. That's how bad it currently is. However, potentially some good news for Aston Martin with the rules that might well be getting changed. So Alonso, Hamilton and Verstappen were among the most critical of the new regulations. Now, Hamilton finished the test far happier, it felt like, that he started it, at least with regard to what the racing is like, the lifting, coasting on qualifying laps and all of that. He's not a big fan of that. He is a pretty big fan of the Ferrari, as we've seen Hamilton suggest in recent days, but I do think that these concerns that Verstappen, Hamilton, Alonso raised, and the other drivers agree with in large part. Norris even said that he agrees, he was just rage baiting, basically. So the drivers are pretty much in agreement. They don't really like the way that these regs have gone. Not necessarily from an aero perspective or from the way that the cars are, but just the way the power units are, the way they have to be driven. Alonso says the chef could drive it in turn 12 because you're nowhere near the limit, because you're super clipping. You've got the MGUK that is regeneratively braking the car at full throttle to regenerate enough energy so you can actually launch up off the corner and back down the straight. And Bahrain is good for recharge, right? So when we go to circuits that aren't good for recharge, that is going to be an even bigger issue than it already is. Now, Aston Martin have no power, so it wouldn't be bad for their power output to be capped by a new change where the manufacturers and Formula One and the FIA are already looking at a plan B. If it's a disaster in Australia, they will look to cut the amount of electrical power that can be deployed. This is a major conversation, and this is one of the solutions that you can have. The other solution, which was apparently asked for by many teams, was what if we have an MGU-K on both the front and the rear axle? Currently it's only at the rear axle, so you don't regeneratively brake from the braking of the front axle. And if that was a thing, then maybe the energy would be in a much better position. You wouldn't have to do all this lifting, coasting and super clipping even on a qualifying lap. It's a big issue. The drivers don't enjoy it. The teams are going to find better solutions, but around Bahrain it got better for sure as the tests went on. But as I say, Bahrain is a good track for this. Other tracks will not be, Melbourne being one of them, Monza, Jeddah, Silverstone, Spa, among others, that are going to be a serious challenge for this regulation cycle. So one option is to say, okay, well, in race conditions, we will just limit the amount of energy that you can actually use in the battery. Instead of having 350 kilowatts, let's just reduce the power by 150 kilowatts, something in that kind of ballpark. That would be reducing the total power of these cars substantially, right? They'd go from 1,000 horsepower down to 850, 820, something in that kind of ballpark if this was to be true. Actually, De Kester describes it in the article here. I'll leave the entire thing linked down below, but anywhere from 80 to 200 less horsepower in that scenario. And look, would that be an embarrassing admission of failure of these engine regs on a regard? Yes, but it might be the only option, effectively. It would also mean that the cars are between 1.5 and 2.5 seconds slower, but it will be better for the driver's feel. They'll be subject to a less unnatural driving style. In an emergency, this should be enough. Clearly, the facts demonstrate that a percentage of electrical power established at the time is simply too high for the available technology. After all, burning more fuel to recharge the batteries remains the antidote. And it's not really a great look for the sport, right? There's all this talk about, oh, well, we're using the batteries because it's more sustainable, or, whatever the spin is. We're going 50-50 between the ICE and the electrical side because that's the future, or whatever. But now you're telling us that you've got to rev the engine more to charge up the battery because the battery's too thirsty. And yeah, you're using sustainable fuels in those internal combustion engines. Fantastic. Why do we need the electrical component at all, one might argue? So that's the discussion right now, that there's already been enough compromises. They discuss the active aero here. They are intended to compensate on what Christian Horner called the Frankenstein car, with this problem that teams saw emerging for some time. Now we are here, and it wasn't great in Bahrain. I think it got better, but it was pretty clear to the drivers and to the teams, and for us watching from home, that these regulations have serious issues on the power unit side. And Bahrain is absolutely better than most tracks when it comes to recharge. So there's a few other theories in what they could do. Many insiders don't think this would be all so dramatic if the countermeasures progress along the development curve. So if the cars figure, if the teams figure out better solutions here, it might not be that bad. But there is an argument that following the Australian Grand Prix, if it's really bad, they may decide to make these changes. And this is the plan B, to reduce the power. Now, the question becomes, how much do they reduce it by? Because as we say, there's quite a substantial variation there. The ICE produces 400 kilowatts, which is like 560, 70 horsepower, something in that ballpark. The electrical side produces 350 kilowatts. The argument is to reduce that to 250. Now, Aston Martin can probably produce 250, so they would be probably quite happy with that, because it would mean that, oh yeah, well, we can actually give that amount of horsepower. Now, they would still be qualifying P21, P22, because presumably in qualifying, you can still use the full force of the battery. But in the race, the idea is to reduce it. And yes, it would be a pretty crude solution, which doesn't feel in line with anywhere, they would be hard pressed to explain this away in a positive manner. And yeah, as I say, it admits to plenty of problems with these regulations. It may be necessary. But Mercedes, presumably because they think they have an advantage in this rule cycle, they would prefer fewer cuts. Maybe because, well, there's two sides of the story here, really. If they believe their internal combustion engine is massively better than anybody else's, then presumably they would want more cuts, because the less energy you have from the electrical side the more important the power unit on the ICE becomes, and that's where you can have a difference, because there's an absolute hard limit of 350 kilowatts on the electrical side, but on the ICE it's considered to be roughly 400, but there's some talk that Mercedes might have pushed that even as high as 420 kilowatts. So, yeah, 415, something in that ballpark. So they're up towards the high 500s horsepower. So you might argue that actually they would want the opposite. But also, there is a point of the electrical energy can be recharged more effectively by a really strong internal combustion engine, so maybe they would actually want the opposite. So I'm not 100% sure what implies what, but I think what we can be clear of, if most of the teams are saying, we want to really reduce it from 350 down to 250 during a race, and Mercedes are saying not so fast, we want half of that reduction, it would still be substantial, but it would be roughly half. There's probably a reason why Mercedes is saying that. So the debate will continue. Mercedes want the regulations to be as close as possible to what we currently have, where presumably they feel like they have a substantial advantage. And of course, just to clarify, none of this is happening yet. This is all a plan B conversation if Australia is an absolute disaster. So very much enjoy your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. But we only have one more Sunday left. Today is Monday. 2 weeks today, we will know the winner of the Australian Grand Prix, and we will know where the season has begun. This, of course, a picture from 2022 with that iconic Mercedes with the zero pods. What a colourful grid we had those years ago. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.